Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Emerald Planet. All the ecology news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's your host, Executive Director of the Emerald Planet, Dr. Sam Lee Hancock.
Hello, welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States. As we look around the globe in 144 different nations, looking for those 1,000 best practices, technology, services, and products that are making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And as we go to a planet of about 9 billion people, how are we going to be able to take care of all these people? And at the same time, how do we increase the quality of life and allow people to communicate, to develop their own families, their own businesses, their own farms, everything that they need within their own communities, and at the same time to protect the environment. And as we know, there are many women that are involved in this, and actually in some communities, the women are the real leaders as far as to taking care of the environment and making sure that the soil, the air, the water is clean and healthy for their families. And have someone sitting right beside me who's actually actively involved in this all over the globe. This is Elisa Munoz. She is the Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation here in Washington, D.C. Elisa, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We're glad to be here. This is really a mighty work that you're doing. You came and spoke at our Rotary Club and shared about this. People were very energized and excited about what you had to say. Because, you know, thinking about women as far as the media is concerned, and there's more and more getting involved in that. So tell us a little bit about your organization and the mission, the philosophy. We'll talk a little bit about its background and then some of the work that you're doing.
Of course.
Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The International Women's Media Foundation was founded 30 years ago by a group of female journalists right here in Washington, D.C., who realized that although they were quite successful, that they were facing a glass ceiling. And they also recognized that working together, they would be able to address the obstacles that they were facing better. At around the same time, the Iron Curtain was falling, and they started to hear stories about women journalists around the world and the incredible obstacles that they faced, and yet they persevered and stayed in journalism, and they wanted to recognize those women. So they founded the organization with a Courage in Journalism Awards ceremony that they held every year, and we still do to this day. We just held them as well, recognizing 3 female journalists around the world who really persevere against all odds to share the news. And some of those women report on corruption, and a lot of corruption has to do with environmental issues and resources and who's owning those resources. And so many of the journalists that we work with and recognize have dealt with these issues. We also give fellowships and grants. We organize reporting trips where we take a number of female journalists around the world to report on various issues, but one of our main sub-themes is the environment.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I want to say that all the photos we're going to be seeing throughout the interviews, all are done by female journalists.
Yes.
And these are many different countries and continents that are being featured here. But looking at all this, you talked about it was about 30 years ago when you started this. Some of the why, because, you know, the breakup of the old Soviet Union and all that. But as far as the women, why in Washington, D.C., and why this particular group?
We really, part of our mission, well, our principle, our guiding principle is that the media cannot truly be free without the equal voice of women. So what we are fostering is diversity in the news media, and that means that we want to support more female journalists around the world. Obviously, diversity comes in many different facets, but what we are supporting is female journalists, and we want to be sure that they have the tools, the safety training, the finances that they need to do the job that they want to do. And that often means that they rely on us to get funding to tell these stories, because many international media organizations just aren't sending people around the world to spend 2 weeks reporting on these issues.
Yeah, and looking at these photographs, I mean, many of these are coming out of real needs that people have in these various communities. But when you look at it, much of this can be extrapolated. So when you look at this scene right here, I've been in China, I've been in, well, 93 countries, but China, India, many different countries. And you can see the scene just about anywhere, but it needs to be brought out and brought out repeatedly so that people have an understanding of what really is going on around. So looking at the programs and issues, besides the Fellows program, what's some of the other things that you actually are doing? Again, you mentioned a few of those. Let's go back through that.
Well, really, we have a number of key programs that we do. One is called our reporting trips for women journalists, where we get applications from hundreds of female journalists from around the world. We select 12 of them to go on reporting trips. We do about 19 trips a year to the Great Lakes region of Africa and also to Central America, Colombia, and the US-Mexico border. And throughout all of these trips, we touch on various themes, of course, the environment being one of them. What that does is twofold. It gets underreported stories out to the public, stories that others may not be investing in, stories that just aren't told. And it also gives these female journalists bylines that they need to get ahead in their careers.
So it's just like people going for tenure as far as university is concerned. You have to have so many publications. As far as journalism, You need to have so many bylines and all that. And I understand that's something that's very, very important. And they're both doing photography. They're also doing videography. And I understand you're doing radio, print. So it's any media, correct?
Any medium, absolutely. All kinds of platforms. Freelance journalists as well as staff journalists as well. We really like to pair up photojournalists with other journalists so that sometimes they meet each other right there on the spot and decide that they're going to work together. And so they cover an issue together, they cover stories together, they pitch them together, and it turns out to be a great thing. That's
absolutely fantastic. Now, what is a fellow? That keeps coming up in all the things that we keep talking about, this fellow. And how do you go about selecting on? Is that the 12 that you were talking about? Is that a fellow?
It is. So we have two different programs. One is called our Adelante program. That's obviously the program that we do in Central America. And the other one is called our Great Lakes Reporting Fellowship. So all of the women who participate in those reporting trips we refer to as IWMF fellows. And they spend 2 weeks with us on the ground in each of these countries. But before we go, they spend 4 days taking a very intense hostile environments training. Many of the places where we're reporting are very, very dangerous, and we want these women to be equipped with the skills that they need to stay safe when they're with us, but also beyond. And as you well know, covering environmental issues is often a pretty dangerous beat, and so even more importantly that they get the training that they need to stay as safe as possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that as far as how dangerous it is. Most people say, oh, they're talking about, you got to clean the water or, recycling and all that. Many of these people are talking about, the illegal logging that's going on, illegal extraction of various minerals, gold, silver, coltan, diamonds. You can talk about the blood diamonds. Right. So they really are, in many cases, in harm's way.
Absolutely.
So a little bit about that. We have just a little bit of time, but I'm very interested in that as far as this safety that they learn, and how does that protect them, because they're doing it now, but you're saying this is something that's going to carry on through their whole professional career.
Absolutely. Well, the hostile environments training is really like it sounds, extremely physical training. They learn how to get out of handcuffs, how to get out of duct tape. They do mock kidnapping scenarios, and it's really...
My goodness, this is incredible.
Yeah, it's really meant to give them a sense of how they would react personally, and to get control of those reactions and sort of almost refer to muscle memory in their response. We have a story of a fellow who was in the DRC, and her camp was overrun
by the
Democratic
Republic of the Congo.
The Democratic Republic of the Congo, sorry, yes. Her camp was overrun by guerrillas, and she fortunately was not hurt. And she told us that when this was happening and when she started running away from the gunfire, she knew the direction that the gunfire was coming in because she remembered her training. She dove into an abandoned mine and hid there for more than 24 hours until these guerrillas had left. But she told us that she had actually remembered her training, and she kept thinking about her training when she was in that situation. And so, unfortunately, it's necessary real life training that they need to refer to in their careers.
Yeah, and that is very unfortunate, but you're providing something it can really use.
Absolutely.
Now, looking at these fellows, many of them are involved in climate change, protecting the environment, involving people as far as the involvement is concerned. So how do they come up with these stories, and then how do they get this out to the media so the media says, okay, this is something that's really newsworthy, we can use it? Because most of the time, if it's good news, they're not really interested in. You know, there's something that needs to be very negative or something very dark. But yet, most of these stories that you have is very refreshing, enlightening, and people can actually use this as a best practice.
Right. Well, that's part of our objective, to really change the narrative that's coming out of these countries. We want people to be able to relate to the people who are being reported about. And if it's all doom and gloom and statistics, then we really believe that there's no relatability. You can't see yourself in somebody, well, we here in Washington cannot see ourselves in somebody who's in a war-torn country, but we can probably relate to a mother who's just trying to feed her child, or who's trying to get clean drinking water. So it's about changing that narrative and making people more relatable, but also touching on those best practices that you're referring to. What happens is we announce that a trip of ours is upcoming, and we call for applications. As I said, we get hundreds of applications for each of these trips. And part of what we evaluate is the stories that they're pitching. We've been doing this for a long time, so one of the key objectives of this program is to get as many of these stories published as possible. We want people to be reading these articles about the environment, about these issues, about these countries. And so optimizing the end product is really part of the selection process. We get pitches for stories, sometimes from teams, sometimes from staff members. But it's a group of women journalists who have a track record, who have contacted editors at various media organizations and gotten at least a level of interest. So it's not just a shot in the dark, oh, I'm going to write this story that I haven't talked to anybody about. There's not a promise, obviously, of publication, but there is some kind of understanding that there's interest.
Well, the whole thing about this, and we're running out of time, as you can tell, but what do you see for the growth and expansion of IWMF over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years? We got about 10 seconds.
We hope to get more funding to be able to do more of these reporting trips, because they help the female journalists, and they also help to highlight key issues in our world.
As we create the Emerald Planet.
This is the story of a boy who is very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where nothing could get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. It made him feel uncomfortable. One day, he found out he had something called autism. His family got him help, and slowly, he learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies. Selfie, nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Being a dad is an adventure full of special moments.
A cruise!
Surprise!
Unexpected moments.
I got this.
And even awkward moments.
Okay, Dad, thank you.
But every moment you spend with your kids, even the smallest moments, can make the biggest impact on your child's life. So take a moment to be a dad today.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door. But it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket. Again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
we're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Welcome to the Emerald Planet as we're looking around the globe for what we call the best of the best, the 1,000 best practices, technologies, services, products, and the processes, of course, as we move through the 21st century. And we go to a planet of 9 billion people by 2050 and possibly 12 to 13 billion by the end of the century. How are we going to be able to take care of all these people so that they have an increased quality of life and not just exist on planet Earth? So this involves not only the environment and making sure that we have clean, land, air, and water, but at the same time that people are able to take care of their families, to start their own businesses, have good, clean jobs within their localities, and they can contribute back to the education, the health care, and all the other related services that they need. And we have someone sitting right beside me who's actually working on all these various topics, but from the standpoint of journalism. And This is absolutely fantastic. This is Elisa Munoz. She is the Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And they have what's called Courage in Journalism Awards.
Yes.
Now, this is actually something that's been going on for a long time. It's huge. And it allows you to reach out to communities and to other people that may not know anything about women, in journalism, but all of a sudden, courage in journalism, that has a special spark and has a special hook to it. So tell us about that. But first of all, a little bit about your organization, why it's so important, and then what it's doing worldwide, even though you started in Washington, D.C. You're all over the globe.
We are. Thank you very much for having me. The International Women's Media Foundation was founded to support female journalists around the world. And most people aren't aware that only about 30% of journalists are women. And depending on the country where they are located, women are working in different levels of that news media. But all around the world, there are very few women at the higher levels of the news media. What the IWMF does is provide support, skills training, opportunities, grants, and recognition. And part of that recognition for female journalists, which we don't believe they get enough of, is through our Courage in Journalism Awards.
The whole thing about this, when you look at society, really, particularly in the United States, men are now the minority because there's about 54% of the population are female. And if you go to some countries, it may be as high as 60%. So why aren't more women going up through the ranks as far as media? Because you're covering videography, TV, radio, newsprint. There's so many, and of course now it's all the internet. So there's many different types as far as media. What is this glass ceiling, and how are you getting through that? Or is this what you've been working 30 years to get through that glass ceiling?
Well, that's a really good question. If we knew
and then we're going to go to what courage is all about in your program.
If we knew where that ceiling, where that crack could be made, we would certainly be chipping away at it. So we're going about it from a variety of ways. Again, one is the opportunities. And so really trying to get women journalists around the world the opportunities that they're not getting in their newsrooms, the assignments to cover international stories, and the recognition when they do good work and when they are extraordinary, which is almost always, to highlight that work.
Now, looking at that, courage in journalism. Now, why use that term? You think about professionalism, you think about, there's all kinds of descriptors that you can have for that, but courage.
Yeah.
So why the word? What's the hook for that?
Obviously 30 years ago, there was a different foundation for using that word courage, and unfortunately in the last couple of weeks we've had really stark reminders about just how dangerous the profession is. Pipe bombs sent to CNN, the tragic and horrible death of Jamal Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey. And so it's been a rude awakening for the United States that journalists continue to be oppressed and that press freedom is under attack right here at home, and certainly continues to be oppressed and attacked abroad. And so the word courage is, I think, incredibly fitting of any individual, male or female, who is really dedicating their life to taking on the hard work of holding people to account.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about all these things currently, but 30 years ago is when you actually came up with this, this title, The Courage. What was going on in those days that we can extrapolate forward to what's happening today? And are there any topics then that there's passé that we're not, faced with anymore, or is it just more of the same, but we're 30 years later?
Yeah, well, at the time that the organization was founded, the Iron Curtain was falling, and stories were coming out of those countries about remarkable female journalists and the work that they had been doing all of that time behind the Iron Curtain that we did not know about, and working under really difficult conditions. And so that was part of the impetus behind the award. Sadly, we really believe that the issues that are being covered and the kinds of threats and harassment and attacks that the women who we work with are facing are repetitive. You could look at some of our award winners from 25 years ago, from 30 years ago, from last year, and from this year, and sadly, you would not be reading stories that are drastically different.
Yeah, and the whole thing about that is that's really sad that we're not progressing as a society. Mm-hmm. Many scholars say we don't really learn from history.
Right.
And we need to be learning from history and carry this forward. So as far as what would be 3 stories, say over the last 5 or 10 years, that really stick out to you that maybe is turning the pages and making a real difference, that hopefully future generations won't have to keep repeating the same thing?
Well, I think part of the Courage Awards are incredibly inspiring. So I think that while the threats and attacks that the women are facing, we can take heart in the fact that these women and many, many more like them are lining up to do this job. Journalism schools are overflowing with female candidates and female students, and hopefully these women will have opportunities that have been denied to so many before them. Obviously, the situation is getting better for women journalists in the United States to a certain degree. That has changed some, but there's always steps that are going backwards, and we really want to make sure that we're there to guard that they don't go too far back.
Yeah, and that's really a shame, but if you look at 30 years back, that's when really the environmental issues really came to the fore. Looking at the ways, the Arab oil embargoes, how do we become energy independent? Mm-hmm. How do we start using renewables, all these other kinds of things. So looking at the women in journalism, when you and I were talking specifically within the green space, are there some that stick out in your mind that are involved in this space? And are there any particular stories that are really compelling, that are helping, and not just in the United States, but it could be in Central Africa, it could be in Latin America, across the South Pacific, anywhere that you have those contacts that they're talking about these things?
Well, if you go to our website, you can see a lot of the stories that have been covered through our Adelante project and our Great Lakes Region project. And I think one of the things that stands out in the stories that are coming out of those projects is that a large number of them are being told from the perspective of women. Mm-hmm. How is climate change?
So that's the real change you see over these 30 years then?
Well, I think so. I think that when you have a diversity of voices in the news media, when you have a diversity of lenses through which you're seeing a subject, then you get a different story. And so I was just in preparation for this show looking at the past few years of stories that have come out specifically on environmental issues. And I was really struck by, certainly not 100% of them, but nearly half of the stories were being told from the perspective of women, mothers, who were trying to improve their environment from that perspective. And they went on to look like your typical environmental stories referring to science and to economics, et cetera, but it really pulled you in terms of those unique perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking at this is something I know that we met before, through the Rotary and all that, and you're really trying to have the emphasis on stories, because this is what brings people in. They can relate to that. It's about families. Mm-hmm. It's about communities. It's about, you know, the extension of friends within the communities, people that you work with. So over these last few decades, how are you increasing the narrative so that more of these personal stories is not just, you know, facts and figures, but people are telling something from, you know, in the Great Lakes region of Africa, you know, across Latin America, that people say, well, I'm in Northern Europe, but I can relate to this. Or I'm in, you know, I'm in the South Pacific and I'm faced with these things on, you know, a day-to-day basis as far as, you know, water or sanitation, these kinds of things.
Well, it has to be really intentional. You know, our objective is to make the people around the world relatable to you and your own experiences. So we're not going in and covering stories of statistics of the number of people killed or the number of children starving. We are going in and spending time, and that time is necessary to build trust. And so if you want to hear stories of real people, you have to invest to be on the ground, you have to invest the time that it takes to build the trust, and you have to want to tell those stories most of all.
Now, how do you, when you're training these people, they come in, you're selecting the 12 on an annualized basis, you know, they have this intensive training before they go, and then they have an actually opportunity on the ground to go in and I assume to work on news stories and then get this out. How do you do that so when you're putting this fabric together is that, yes, you want this to be very factual, but at the same time, we want to really share, you know, the human tragedy, the triumphs, the challenges, the rewards, all of that. How do you help them do that? And we have very few seconds left.
Well, it's two different types of programs that we do. So when we take people around the world to report, they're journalists. So we're not telling them how to report. They've been at it for a long time, and it's 12 people for each trip, and it's about 20 trips that we do per year.
Oh, that's a great number of people then.
It is. But we also do in-country training, and so we are trying to support local journalists to be able to report on their own communities, and I think that that's really an important factor as well, in particular local female journalists.
Courage and Journalism Awards, what do you see for the growth and expansion of this over the next 5, 10, 15 years? We've got to be quick.
Well, we've been doing it for 30 years, and there will never be a shortage of courageous female journalists. So.
Elisa Munoz, she's Executive Director, International Women's Media Foundation. Thank you for being with us as we look around the globe to create the Emerald Planet.
So, I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school.
Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
I know.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Thank you for being with us as we come to you on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States, because we are looking around the globe in 144 different nations, looking for the 1,000 best practices that are making a difference. And looking at all these, we've covered, literally hundreds and thousands of different topics, equally amount of best practices, solutions, as we say, the best of the best. But really it's a philosophy that really has to move forward. And we need to think about things or how we're bringing about real change to real people, but all beings on the planet. So how we're taking care of the animals, how we're taking care of all the plants, as well as the humans, because without all the animals and plants, we're not going to exist very long on planet Earth. And we have someone sitting right beside me who's actually covering all these various things, or her colleagues are covering all these things, we should say. This is Elisa Munoz. She's the Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation in Washington, D.C. And welcome to the Emerald Planet TV.
Thank you.
Now, this is really interesting. We're getting into endangered species, and we're going to see a lot of animals in these photographs here. And this is an incredible story that you have. But looking at why endangered species among your fellows, so let's first talk about what's a fellow, remind what that is, and then why endangered species. And this seems, every time I go, to these events, people really just seem to identify, or they really want to know more about this. Why endangered species?
Right. Well, the remarkable female journalists that took many of these photographs are IWMF fellows who joined us on reporting trips where we took them and a number of their colleagues to report from the Great Lakes region of Africa and also from Central America, Mexico, and Colombia. What we do is we facilitate this reporting, and so we have the privilege of being able to take them on the ground to provide their drivers, their fixers, their security training, because many of these stories are dangerous to cover, and really to let them do the work that they do best.
Yeah, and this is incredible, and having all these animals in here too makes this really a very special part of our discussion that's going on right now. But Alfreda Culpepper wants to know, what's the difference between reporting on these endangered species, or animals in general, because we're doing that as well, and general environmental impacts. So is there a difference, or do these just meld together as far as the news cycle?
Well, I think that the issue of endangered species is always going to capture people's attention. I think the loss of a species is always going to be felt. People feel it very personally, and really it's heartbreaking. And the reporting of it is also very different, because these are stories that are difficult to get. To be able to cover an animal or a species that is disappearing means that you've got to go out into the ground, you've got to spend the time to find them, you have to spend the resources to get there. Some of these places where these animals are very dangerous, and you really have to have some support, usually, to be able to do it safely and to be able to do it well. And I think that's what sets these stories apart.
Yeah, looking at this is something that I wanted to discuss, here on the TV. You're going in these places, and as you said, many of these places actually really are quite dangerous.
Yeah.
I've been in 93 countries, and I've been in a lot of these areas, and this is not for the faint of heart to do this. But looking and working with the local people that live in those areas, how do you create those linkages, and then how do the fellows expand on those linkages so that they become part of the story, part of the narrative as well, so that, yes, we're talking about these endangered species, but the people living in these areas are either attacking these species or they're protecting, or it may be a combination of the two. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think it normally is a bit of a combination of the two, and we do a lot of work in advance. So for example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where many of these photographs taken with the gorillas occurred, we developed a relationship with an area and a park, a national park, where they were taking care of these gorillas, and it's extremely dangerous. In fact, we probably won't be able to go back there for some time because it's been the center of part of the fighting in the DRC, which has further put these animals in danger. Many of the park rangers who work to protect these species have been hurt and killed. Sadly, one of the women rangers who was covered in one of these stories, she was the focus of one of these stories, was actually killed not long ago. So it's not only the reporters are in danger when they're covering these stories, but certainly the people who are on the ground doing this day to day are in danger throughout their day-to-day operations, and it's very tragic.
Yeah, and we talk about the isolation and how these places are far away. So we've gone from, Congo DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, jungle area, and now we're at the Arctic.
Right.
So we're really jumping around, but it just shows the diversity as far as the coverage.
Right.
So how do these fellows decide, I want to go to Congo DRC?
Right.
No, I'm going to go
Yeah.
to the Arctic Circle. No, I'm going to go to the South Pacific. How does those decisions get made?
Well, we're so lucky that we can offer these opportunities. The reporting trips that we lead are to very specific countries, and so we do a call for applications for those. And the remarkable women who have gone to the Arctic or to the South Pacific, they're applying for grants from the IWMF. So we're actually supporting reporting that is not being covered by major media organizations or by traditional media organizations, but these women pitch us their stories. We have a committee of professional journalists, among them our board members, sometimes former fellows, former grantees, and we determine, this story needs to be told, and we're going to invest in you, and we're going to invest in the story.
Now, looking in these areas, and you can see how remote this is, but as far as the looking at the conditions that they have there, many of these are at risk or impoverished communities, very rural areas.
Yeah.
So how do you work with them to make sure that they're, again, really going back to this question earlier, they're part of the narrative, but also they're going to benefit from these stories and benefit from the coverage that's being brought to them in these areas?
Well, our objective is really to change the narrative that's coming out of these places. So, for example, we keep going back to the DRC story. Most of the reporting out of the DRC has to do with the conflict, with the remarkable amounts of rape that has occurred in that country, with the awful history that is taking place, with the Ebola outbreak, and all of those are critically important stories that need to be told. Those aren't particularly the stories that we're focused on. We're going to tell underreported stories. The reporters that want to cover those stories aren't being supported and aren't able to do those stories without our help. So that's the slight difference.
Now, looking at this, this is an area, of course, many of the communities around the globe are cutting trees, shrubs, all these things to make charcoal, which is actually putting heavy particulate matter into the air.
Yeah.
It's almost a death sentence to anyone that lives in the type of housing they have where it's open hearth or open fire burning. So looking at this is something where it's marginal, where you may be in areas that's not quite as isolated as, say the Arctic zone or, with the gorillas in the Congo DRC. But yet people really don't want you there in these areas because a lot of this is illegal cutting of timber.
Yeah.
And many of these countries have rules that says, don't do this, but yet it's happening on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So how do the people get those stories out and at the same time really do be safe so that they get back, with their loved ones?
Well, we do all we can to make sure that all of the reporting that is done is as safe as possible. And you may have noticed that I always say as safe as possible because I actually can't say 100% safe or safe even. There's a remarkable amount of logistics that takes place. We have a security director on staff who does a risk assessment before we depart. We have security protocols that are extremely strict. We sometimes take one, sometimes two security directors on the ground with us on these trips. The fellows have very strict instructions about what time they need to be off the road. And so it really takes a remarkable amount of preparation, and that's what makes this reporting so difficult too. I'm sure you're aware that more and more reporting is reliant on freelancers.
Right.
And so about half of our fellows, or more even, are freelancers, and they just would not be able to get to these places and tell these stories even in a remotely safe way if they didn't have the support that we're able to provide them.
Now, looking at this photograph right here, now this is totally unsustainable as far as what you're seeing here, making this charcoal. And you have a country like Haiti, which is about 2% of the whole nation's under canopy, meaning it has foliage, it has trees in different areas. And so you have just millions of acres, actually, of land that's just washing out into the Caribbean. So looking at this, how does sustainability fit into the overall schema as far as the themes, say the selection of these 12 fellows that are coming in? Does that become a key consideration, or is that one of the considerations that they go through?
Well, I think it's one of the considerations. I mean, they're selected based on the stories that they're pitching, as well as their experience and their track record for publishing in certain publications, or maybe even potentially publishing on these subject areas. But I think that what the fellows are looking at from an environmental perspective is to show the degradation and the impact of what is happening on the ground. But from a humanistic perspective, the people who are burning this wood, as you mentioned, are doing so at risk to their health. It's oftentimes a last resort. And so that's why the story becomes so dangerous, because it's pointing out really the insustainability of what is going on the ground. And if that is going on the ground, what is happening in that community that's making that a necessity?
Yeah, and looking at sustainability, I think about this, Elisa, is that it's not only just sustainability as far as the environment is concerned, but sustainability of these communities where people are living and their families.
Right.
Because many of these people are living in areas which is totally unsustainable. And so it's just a really, it's a real challenge in every way. But Americans probably are not aware of everything that's going on as far as, the endangered species, and again, going back to these communities, because a lot of the animals are being killed to eat. It's what's called bush meat in a lot of these places. And if people don't have it, they starve. So we got 31 seconds. Looking at your organization, how do you continue this work as far as the endangered species to allow people to know what's really going on? We've got about 20 seconds.
Sure. I mean, really, we are just supporting journalism and supporting these stories as we support other stories around the world when other organizations don't, is really how to keep it alive.
That's just absolutely fantastic. Elisa Munoz of the IWMF. This was great, the EmeraldPlanet.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. I already posted it.
I got a crick in my neck, limp in my step, cramping in my muscles every time I try to flex. I don't know what to get on. It's very sad that I can do this, was remember you. You know I usually stay now, but if you throw me love, I'll throw you some more.
It's a big responsibility.
Oh, it's huge. I know, it's huge.
And the salary.
Oh my god, yes.
Right?
I mean, like, I was about to move in with my parents, and right before, so this saved me.
I really believe in you, you know?
Thank you. It's nice to hear that from someone.
These are cool. Did you, what did
we're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Thank you for being with us as we come to you on a week-to-week basis from Washington, D.C. in the United States. We are looking at 144 different nations and actually reaching out to the rest of them as far as what is the compelling stories, at the same time, what are the solutions, the best of the best as far as best practices to deal with everything that's happening on planet Earth. And as we go from about 7.5 billion people on planet Earth to about 9 billion by 2050, and maybe 12 to 13 billion by the end of this century, how are we going to bring about the changes that are truly needed to address all of these different issues? And I have someone sitting right beside me that's actually working with a really large organization. We can say that because it covers the whole globe. This is Elisa Munoz. She's the Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And we're going to be talking about just what's going on in local communities as far as minerals, about illegal mining and the gems trade that's happening, talking about like blood diamonds and other kinds of things, and how this really impacts the local community and how are women connected through that, not only with the reporting, but how are women connected that with these local communities, their families, to try to do something very different than that's going on there. So tell us a little bit about, reaching out to these different areas and trying to strike this balance between the environment and the economy so that people have viable options and are not trapped in something that they really don't want to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, the objective of the programs that the International Women's Media Foundation is running right now that touch on environmental issues is really to change the narrative that is coming out of these countries. And so addressing the various circumstances from the perspective of the communities that are living through them. So part of how we select the reporters who we support to come on reporting trips that we organize or to give grants to really has to do with that perspective and how they're approaching the particular topic.
And I think this is really interesting is how you're trying to strike this balance, and again, this approach. Are they doing it from the standpoint of the smugglers, from the standpoint of the nation states that are buying up, the gold, the cotton, the silver, diamonds, semi-precious stones and all that? How is it affecting the local economies? Is it taking people away from growing food? And they're trying to eke out a living by taking these minerals. So looking at the fellows and looking at the reporting, how do you pursue that, or do you just allow them to decide how they want to bring that out? And then dealing with the people in these local communities?
Well, we do not exercise any kind of editorial control once we select our reporters and they're on the ground reporting. We are merely assisting them to get the stories that they want to do. What they have done is they've pitched stories to us, and that's how they've been selected, and they've usually ahead of time pitch stories to editors, to either their own editors or if they're freelancers to other media organizations with whom they're working. So we do not exercise any kind of editorial control, and it's important to say that. What we do is we facilitate the reporting on the ground, which means talking to those individuals in the communities that are being impacted. And sometimes those individuals are really hard to get to, and so really just even providing the opportunity to be on the ground for 2 weeks in places that are really difficult to access makes all the difference.
And talking about the reporters, you have this, the Courage Award that you're doing on an annualized basis and doing it over 30 years now. But these women really are putting their lives at risk, and maybe even that, or their families if they're from local communities, because you talked about the breakup of the Soviet Union and what had been going on literally through the underground press in some of these countries. And that is very dangerous. I mean, I've been, all over Russia and many of these countries, and this is not an easy thing to do. So looking at it, how can they report on what we're seeing here? These are maybe some of the blood diamonds we're talking about, but at the same time, to do that in a safe manner? I know you do the training and all that, but is there a special connection with the communities that allows them to be safer in what they're doing and yet still get the story out so it's viable for, you know, the greater body politic around the globe?
Well, I would be remiss if I did not stress how much more dangerous it is for local journalists than it is for the journalists who we bring in and the journalists who come into the country and then leave. And I think it's really important not only to make that point, but also to support local journalists. So we do skills training in country, we do hostile environments training in country for local journalists everywhere that we work, because we don't believe in parachuting in, getting our story and leaving. So we really do want to support local journalism community as well as getting these stories out.
You know, and this is something, and I was really teeing this up so you could talk about that. Looking at the difference between the local reporters and the ones that are coming internationally. There, if they're coming from, you know, a major donor state or whatever, even though it's dangerous, it may be easier for them. But if you're a local, I mean, you're really at the mercy of, you know, all the local politics, you know, the government apparatus and all that. And it's just like these ladies here that are protesting as far as taking farmlands that they need to grow food and at the same time to protect the environment to use, you know, for much of this, which may be illegal mining. So looking at these local reporters, you know, a number of them are slain on a year-to-year basis. So, but what really drives them to do that? We know that it's the story, it's the narrative, they want to protect their communities, but there must be something out there that they're saying, I just have to do this. Yeah.
Well, we know from our Courage in Journalism Award winners from the last 30 years that journalism is really a calling. It's not a job that people
passion,
go to.
It's a work, huh?
It's a passion, it's a calling. Right. They are trying to improve their countries, their communities, their lives, the lives of their families and their neighbors. And it's really a drive that I don't see every day when I go to other places and see people doing their jobs. It's one of a handful of jobs where people are putting their lives on the line frequently when they're doing this work. And I think that that's another reason why it's so important to recognize the importance of press freedom, the importance of supporting journalism, the danger that comes with attacking journalism.
Yeah, and this is something that unfortunately more and more as far as the state apparatus, you know, even in countries supposedly are open democracies and support the freedom of the press and all that, there seems to be a tightening down as far as what's acceptable, what's not acceptable to be reported on. And then even the freedoms that you have to move around and to, you know, just research the stories and all that and then get it out into the greater press and have it published. Is the internet in any way is helping to make that easier, or is it making it more difficult for these journalists to actually get their stories out and to impact beyond just their own local community?
I think it's fairly clear that the internet helps get the story out. I think what we're facing today in terms of trying to make sure that people understand the validity of some stories, recognizing when stories are coming from sources who are
like
not
fake
who they
news
say they
is
are.
the term, yeah.
Well, I think fake news is really being ascribed to real journalism as often as it's being ascribed to fake journalism. I'm talking about state-sponsored stories or trolls or all kinds of threats that are happening online as well. That is also important to recognize. We haven't talked about it a lot here, but a lot of threats, harassment, and attacks are directed at journalists, and particularly at female journalists. We just published a report that IWMF did on harassment and attacks and their impact, focusing on online harassment, and it is a factor that is driving female journalists out of the workforce because those attacks are so gendered and so hostile and aggressive and threatening. They actually lead to similar symptoms of PTSD, and it's a very difficult environment to work in. So you have the physical danger, you have the online danger, You have both of those factors driving female journalists out of the workforce, leading to even less diversity and representation in the news media than already exists. These are all really things that should concern everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, looking at, there are a number of countries where actually it's becoming extremely dangerous to be involved in the media. And I'm not going to name any of these countries. But is there a way through your organization, through various apparatus of governments that really are the sponsors of free and open media, free and open information exchanges and all that, can actually help the journalists within these countries? Mm-hmm. Or is it really almost country by country, and if they're hostile to open media in that country, that's just the way it is?
I think there are a number of organizations that support press freedom and advocate for policies that support press freedom. I think a lot of the oppression of press freedom that is happening online and is happening in ways that don't necessarily it's not necessarily a result of policies, it's really a result of actions that are being taken, journalists being imprisoned, harassed, attacked, killed frequently as well. One of the things that the IWMF does is we have an emergency fund for female journalists, and so unfortunately we're dealing with the aftermath of these attacks, and sometimes it's quite grave. And so we provide support for journalists to leave their homes, to leave their countries, to get physical, medical care, to get care for trauma that they've experienced. And there isn't a lot of that kind of support out there. Journalists are sometimes just left to fare for themselves.
That's terrible. We only have about 30 seconds. So looking at your organization, what do you see for the growth expansion of your organization over the next 5 or 10, 15 years? And is there one or two areas that you know that you're really going to start focusing on that's going to have the greatest impact in your mind as far as journalism and women in the future?
Yeah. Well, really continuing to provide opportunities to female journalists and being able to provide more of those, but as always, helping female journalists to stay as safe as possible through training and support is probably part of what we're going to be doing for another 30 years.
Or maybe 300 years, it's going to go on for a long, long time. This is Elisa Munoz. She's Executive Director, International Women's Media Foundation. Thank you for being with us on this very important topic of women, journalism, and the economy and environment as we create the Emerald Planet.